I've heard many people criticizing the very fact that you're talking about, that it was really negative yesterday. I mean, in one of the panels today, I mean, it was a topic for 10 minutes, how pessimistic it was, or how pessimistic we are in Europe right now about challenges. Küfür. We can wait for another minute, maybe two, three. Can I? We are gonna start in a minute, I was told. That's why. I mean, I'm aware of the time, so I'm asking for your patience for another 2 minutes. It is. That has been a problem with all the sessions. So I have a green light. Oh, please.
No, I was going to say, just so you all know, we can't see any of you. There's the most enormous light behind you. right in our eyes.
I can only confirm what Mr. Flaherty said. If I don't catch your hand or anything, you can just yell in hello or anything like that. I'm more than happy to welcome you to what is promising to be a very insightful session on one of the most important issues of our time, of all time actually, human rights. First order of business, I'm thankful that there is such a great turnout because we are aware that there are 3 other very interesting panels happening at the same time. So thanks for coming. I hope it will be worth it. We are going to make sure. We are going to dig as deep as possible today about human rights, for which I couldn't have asked for 2 more knowledgeable individuals to navigate us through this discussion. I'm honored to welcome Ms. Renata Salecl, the renowned philosopher and legal theorist from Slovenia. So I am rather the guest here. Thanks for being with us. And also Mr. Michael Flaherty, one of the first names that come to mind when you think about human rights. Thanks for being with us, sir. Your new role, if I may, is the Commissioner for Human Rights at the Council of Europe after serving for years at the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. Welcome. A couple of ground rules. Consider yourself a part of this panel from the very beginning. There won't be a Q&A session. This is the Q&A session. You're more than welcome to raise your hand and ask a question from the very beginning. We are going to allow and encourage that. Since we have a very fine selection of panelists, we have 2, which does not happen often, you're more than encouraged to go deep, but please do not talk for 15 minutes, which is also a suggestion at the members of the audience. We have 75 minutes, actually 70, so I'm going to go right into the discussion. Let me begin with a simple yet utterly difficult question, Ms. Salecl. You write about many different humane qualities, such as ignorance, apathy, and choice, of course, which is you are known for. The common denominator of all of these qualities they are all human. I think we are all wondering what you think about the current state of human rights worldwide.
Thank you so much. I'm sort of, let's say, not total pessimist, I would say. Since we still have the human rights, we did not change, let's say, the kind of international law, which at least, it's still, written, and it should be respected much more. So I'm a big fan of human rights. Even in kind of philosophical community, there have been many sort of critiques of human rights that they are something obsolete. Like Michel Foucault, a French philosopher, was saying that they are part of the mechanisms of power, and you cannot assess mechanisms of power with something that the power produced, But I'm kind of like going back to Immanuel Kant, who said that human rights actually, in a way, although he didn't yet speak about current ideas of rights, but the idea of rights that he and later philosophers were talking about is linked to the idea of subjectivity, which can critically look at him or herself, the society around, and the world around. So there is this still need to kind of, let's say, be a little bit almost outside of your society and look at you from Kantian perspective in the way that you can critique where you come from. And human rights, although they are very open concept, in a way are something that allows us to keep somehow democracy, let's say, going forward.
I see. Thank you very much. Mr. Flaherty, Ms. Salecl just pointed out that she is not a pessimist. We are all wondering what you think about the current state of, I think we would all agree on that, the unprecedented level of violations of human rights worldwide.
Sure. Well, thanks for the question. Thanks for the invitation. Let's first clarify what the stakes are. Yesterday, in the opening session, we had those political leaders, one after the other, setting out a pretty gloomy picture But every single one of them, every one of them, has said that an essential part of the path out of the mess towards the future is respect for human rights. That's how high the stakes are, and I'm worried. I'm worried for 4 reasons right now. The first is the level of human rights abuse. It's very high everywhere, and it's getting worse in some places. We've always had human rights, by the way, abuse. If that's all we had, we know how to navigate it, but it's worse than that. The second thing is we have a war against the values, the very context, the environment in which human rights can thrive in the form of the Russian aggression. The Russian aggression is not just an attack on Ukraine, it's an attack on every one of us and the values that we believe are sacred to our societies. If they win, then that fabric unravels, including the core elements of human rights. But third of my 4 concerns has to do with the great issues we're facing today. We're facing, look, the list can go, it's an open list, but we're facing these most profound moments in human history, the climate crisis, and how we navigate forward with regard to that, how we do this green transition, the role of AI in our lives, and how quickly that is transforming itself and us. And there are other issues. I leave the list there. But my point here is, there's a challenge there. If we don't embed human rights, concern for the human, using the vocabulary of human rights, if we don't embed that in how we engage with the climate crisis, how we engage with AI, then very quickly human rights will be irrelevant to the core of our lives. And then the final concern, and it interplays with all of the others, is something new and that really frightens me. And that is that it's become fashionable to discuss human rights as past its sell-by date. Human rights is a good idea for its time, but let's move on. It's become fashionable in the elite to have these types of conversations. Do people realize how dangerous these conversations are? There is no plan B. There's no alternative. We only have one universally agreed roadmap to honor human dignity, and that is the human rights system. So it's the interplay of these 4 issues that keep me awake at night.
Thank you, sir. Your point is very well taken, and you stressed upon the universality of the issue, to which we are going to come back in a moment. But I want to take 10 seconds to welcome Ms. Foreign Minister, who is joining us from Andorra. Welcome, madam. You also talked about ongoing wars, the Russian aggression against Ukraine. I think another elephant in the room is the crisis in Gaza today. When you take your phone out today and take a look at the comment section of Western politicians, you see a lot of criticism about double standards. They are accused of double standards. I was wondering, Ms. Salecl, do you agree with that criticism?
Yes, I think so. Yes, I think the UN has been trying, at least, to do something in regard to the human rights situation in Gaza. From ICJ ruling in January to kind of issue the warning to Israel not to engage in genocide, to the prohibitions of the or at least let's say the ideas that countries should not sell weapons to Israel. To also the ICC ruling about the arrest warrant for Netanyahu and Gallant, and what we see now is actually yesterday was the news in Haaretz that even Serbia is now selling weapons to Gaza. There were 5 planes this summer, selling more than $7 million worth of weapons to Israel. So I think that there is like a total ignorance from the side of Israel in regard to these resolutions and the UN sort of discussions about human rights.
I want to stick with the issue of double standards, and I want to ask you, Mr. O'Flaherty, about the so-called regionalism of this human rights discussion, because we have a far-right surge in Europe right now, which has been a topic in basically every session I've been to today. I'm talking about the 2 state elections in Eastern Germany, and the EU elections were also a tangible proof of this. When we talk about human rights violations, we all tend to think about the authoritarian regimes outside of Europe. Do you think that is the right approach, or maybe should we take a look at ourselves?
Before we come to that, I would like to talk just for a moment about this issue of double standards. I want to completely agree with Renata. We have double standards everywhere. We've always had them. But let's be careful. I caught in your question a sense that if the West is doing double standards, that undermines human rights. That suggests that human rights are Western. That's not the case. We must recognize that human rights derive from a global reflection process. They belong to the globe, not to any one region. So forgive me for coming back to your question, but I think it's an important point. But then turning to you, I've spent 8 years working for the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, doing what? Looking at violations of human rights inside the EU. I'm now starting a mandate of 6 years, Council of Europe, doing what? Looking at human rights standards and conditions and violations within the Council of Europe member states. So for me, when you say we think of human rights far away, it doesn't resonate. We have human rights abuse everywhere. We have human rights violation everywhere. We have human rights good practice everywhere. We learned about how to deliver in a human rights respectful way on housing, on social rights. Not from some European country. We got it from the courts in South Africa and India. And so it's very important to also address regionalism from this point of view.
Thank you very much for your response. Once again, you have mentioned something about universality. That's why I think we should talk about that for a moment. I'd like to turn to Ms. Salecl at this point. I'm so glad to have a philosopher on the stage, which does not quite happen often, so that I can ask my wildest questions. We generally speak of human rights as the ultimate, the definite institution, set of values. What do you think about that? Are they really universal in your opinion, or are they merely a Western construction?
No, I will agree with Michael here that they are much, more global than we think. Yes, they emerged through the discussions, let's say, within a kind of a post-enlightenment world, but they are now a global phenomenon. Whoever is fighting for his or her rights, or a group for their rights, they at some point start referring to this universal principle. So I'm very much for the idea that they are universal, but they have been also, let's say, reinterpreted. There has been an enlargement of the idea of human rights. Only in the 80s, children, sort of were included in the Charter of the Human Rights. So the history of human rights is the history for their, let's say, reinterpretation, because subjectivity is changing also. The perception of who is the civilian, for example, now is a crucial issue which we need to discuss very much. Civilians are supposed to be, let's say, protected by international law, but more and more we see in ignorance. They are perceived as human shield, they are perceived as targets, that AI is sort of, let's say, calculating whose life is worth or not. And, they are also perceived more and more as bearers of data. Data which is used also for military purposes, sometimes consciousness and sometimes unconsciousness. So that requires a new thinking, whether we need actually new human rights, which will deal with AI, with climate change, and the new kind of surveillance and military attacks that we are observing.
Very interesting observations, please.
Yeah, I'd like to come right in on this. Look, the first thing before we get to philosophy or law or anything like that, well, it is philosophy, is that without the concept of universality, there's no point in human rights. Universality has to do with the fact that every human on this planet has the same rights by virtue of their human dignity. And if you squander that, you trade that away, then the system falls apart. So even if we couldn't demonstrate in a theoretical way, we need universality. But we can demonstrate in a theoretical, legal, philosophical way. Take the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It emerged from the great schools of thought of the planet. Confucianism influenced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Socialist thinking heavily influenced it. I could go across different parts of the world which fed in. And then what's very important today is to recognize that at least when it comes to the Universal Declaration, we have had repeated universal endorsement. We've had 3 World Conferences on human rights, numerous other occasions where formally, nominally, every country on earth said it subscribes. Now, they violate all over the place. I'm not making some strange claim here, but they formally acknowledge these are our universal shared values. So we should stop discussing universality, and we should invest far more in standing up for it and protecting it.
I have a follow-up question to that. After that, I want to turn to the audience to hear your opinion about this, about the universality discussion. In your role, have you ever experienced a moment, maybe you can tell us about an experience, where you couldn't convey your message because there is, in your field as well, on the philosophical level, but also on the street, in social media, people, let's call it non-Western leaders, who justify their actions by rejecting human rights as a universal concept?
Hey, I don't have to go to non-Western leaders. You'll find plenty of Western leaders who will reject and will push back. We're in a bad moment. We've lost an awful lot of shared understanding of human rights, which we desperately need to preserve and protect the system. We have politicians who see socioeconomic rights, which are an essential part of the human rights story, as somehow not law, not binding, they're just suggestions. Yeah, I've had this numerous times sitting with government ministers. I was with one minister once, and I said, now I'd like to talk about poverty, minister. And the minister said, you're here to talk about human rights, not poverty. Yeah, this is very, very commonplace. Another issue we have to clean up are all of these myths about human rights. So many myths have been allowed to land and take fruit. The myths of the zero-sum game. More human rights, less security. More human rights, less economic resources. Every single one of these can be challenged, and yet they're allowed to ferment. Another one that's very commonplace, I meet it every day in my job, is this business of how do we balance rights. So I'm going to a meeting in 2 days' time, and the concept note for the meeting says I should talk about how in a trial should we balance the rights of the accused and the rights of the victim. Nonsense. We don't balance their rights. We don't trade off their rights to each other. We just make sure that their rights are respected. And it's not some kind of a commercial transaction. So these are just some examples of the myths and the misunderstandings that we'll have to clear up before we give our leaders who make these decisions the full armory to recognize that human rights is not something alien, not something mischievous, and is something that we can all share together.
I had an experience in the academia with similar kind of question years ago. I gave a lecture on the issue of female circumcision from human rights perspective. And actually, I was criticized for being a white European woman speaking about an issue which is happening elsewhere. From the idea of human rights. My idea actually was that you should not perceive such torture as a local phenomenon, but as something that actually very much needs universal thinking, and that it is not looking at the laws of the country and particular perception of femininity in particular cultural context, but perceive as a woman there, where this practice is embraced, and elsewhere as equal. And equal bearer of human rights also when she fights against this praxis.
Thank you very much for sharing this. I want to stand up and take a look at the audience. Does anyone want to add, comment, anything, ask a question? If not, I want you to know, please consider this as one of my audience polls, as I call them. I'd like to know by a show of hands who thinks that human rights are universal. Okay, that's not the overwhelming, it's the 100% of the majority. Who doesn't think they're universal? They're not going to do anything? It's just
It'd be good to hear. It'd be really good to hear.
It will be really good to hear, because, please.
My question, can I ask a question?
Please, of course.
So, I'm from South Africa, and we had a German, an NGO based in South Africa, and we had a German funder the back of what happened in Ukraine put a lot of pressure on us to say something about what's happening in Ukraine. And eventually we did. We said, it's not our area of expertise. We wouldn't normally comment on something that's happening that's not outside our focus areas, but nonetheless we did. Then fast forward, what's happening to after the October the 7th, we then got a call from the same German funder, putting a lot of pressure on us, saying, do not condemn Israel. Don't say anything about Israel. Don't say anything about it at all. Eventually, thankfully, the leadership in our NGO, we decided to part ways with that German organization that's funded also by German political parties. It's just an anecdote, but there's just this general sense of this hypocrisy that you see within the EU, talking about, EU values, but if you literally just replace what they're saying about Ukraine with the word Palestine, it's almost jarring how people don't see the similarities between the two situations. So you talked about double standards, and so it was really just something on the back of my mind. So because we talk about it obviously in philosophical and political terms, but in countries it has real. We could have been an NGO that was solely reliant on that kind of funding, and then would have caved and it would have compromised our position. But thankfully, financially, we weren't in that position.
Could I react, please?
Please.
Yeah.
I thank you very much for saying that, and I entirely accept the hypocrisy to which you speak. It's replete. It's everywhere. I can give you 1,000 other examples. But because of the room we're in and the topic of this conversation, let's not somehow drag human rights down with the hypocrisy, drag human rights down with the double standards. It's not their fault. It's the fault of those who abuse and invoke them. I hate this term, European values. I resist it deeply. It's arrogant, it's condescending, it's hierarchical. It suggests that somehow those of us like me from Europe are somehow better than everybody else. That's absurd. It's deeply in violation of the principle of universality. And I resist it everywhere I go. So all I'm asking is let's not challenge this extraordinary human achievement, human rights, because of the way in which it's misused and misattributed.
Thank you for your comment. I have seen many nodding heads a second ago whilst the madam was talking. Did you want to add something, please? Oh, we can start with him. I know her, so it's okay.
Okay, since I didn't want to take the floor, but I will, since there's the mention of Europe in particular. So I work for the European Union, so perhaps have a different view, which is that those are both tragedies, but they're very different kind of tragedies. And when you make comparisons, you have to compare what's comparable. I think many people would say that there is absolutely no comparison between the Middle Eastern situation and the Ukrainian situation. Not by any means, and I think it's good to have a fair discussion about when rights are violated in one scenario and the other, but I think it's good to be very precise and really to take the factual situation on the ground. I've heard yesterday and today the perspectives of both in Palestine and both Israeli ones. I found many arguments that they made very powerful, and for that reason I think I found the European response to have been more or less one what could expect, and it's therefore I think it's for the discussion it's fundamental that we stay to the idea of human rights, and I very much second what Mr. Flecher said. We have to stay central to what the idea of human rights is, not subvert it into its own opposite, but that's just my personal view.
Thank you for sharing your view with us. Do you want to respond to that? Otherwise, no? Please, Shota. No?
Thank you very much. You touched upon a question that I got very curious immediately when you talk about human rights and digitalization and data. So of course this is not the first thing that we think about when we think about violation of human rights. Could you go a bit into that? What role are, let's say, big companies playing? What is the threat and what should or can be done? What should be aware of in this context about human rights? Because it's almost like an opponent that we cannot put intangible opponent in a sense. And it's so broad also.
Sure. The issue of the interplay of AI, digitalization, and human rights is vast. The extent to which AI can already and will impact for human well-being is comprehensive. Every dimension of human well-being is exposed, for good and for ill. I'm not one of those sort of dystopian speakers about AI. It's about those areas that have received a lot of attention. So, facial recognition technology. Everybody talks about it. It's well known. It's about those violations of privacy. Everybody talks about those. They're well known. But it's also about non-discrimination. It's about the algorithms that discriminate between men and women, black and white, in all sorts of very problematic ways. It's about the fact that AI automated detection tech for online hate only works in certain languages and not in other languages. It's about how you get your social welfare. This is a really automated country, Slovenia. So I bet you that AI is playing a huge role in how the public services work in this country. But look what happened in the Netherlands a few years ago. A whole load of people were stripped of social welfare benefits because the technology made a mistake. And it accused them of being of criminal acts, and it was all the stupidity of the algorithm, frankly. And so every dimension of our lives, and we have to do a big job of building awareness out there in society of the extent to which things impacting my well-being, those decisions are being made not by a person but by a machine, and we have to make sure that machine is properly supervised. And that's why the current discussion around regulation of AI is so important. The Council of Europe has developed a convention. The European Union has developed the AI Act. So we're right in the laboratory right now. I'm not going to pronounce in some grand way about the effectiveness of all this new regulation, because we have to see it in force. But we have to get it right. And for me, and I'll stop with this, the one dimension of regulation that's critical is to keep the human at the heart of regulation, to make sure that human well-being and human thriving is supported by oversight. And the way we do that is putting strong human rights protections at the heart of the systems, formally in the laws, but then in reality in terms of who does the oversight. We need human rights expertise in the regulatory bodies. So the issue is vast, it's exciting, it can achieve great good, but of course, as we all know, a great harm can come if we get it wrong.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Please,
Yeah.
Ms. Salecl.
So I very much agree, with both points. And 6 years ago, a group of researchers from the UK and some Slovenians and also artists, we came together and we decided to start Airspace Tribunals. We went around basically creating forums, asking people what are the new threats to their life, especially in regards to surveillance, military, and sort of ecological issues which are coming in some way from above, airspace and outer space, the satellites and so on. So we created 4 airspace tribunals where, people, international lawyers, victims, people who are working on the digital and so on came together, and we just published a double special issue of a journal, Digital War, which is available also online. Springer published it, where we documented these threats. And this was the idea, which was kind of on the ground of proposing a new human right, which we are now, towards the end of the year, hoping to propose to the European Commission and the UN. And it is the right to protect humans from psychological and physical threats coming from above. And here we think, outer space and airspace in this broader way. We work a lot on the satellites issue, on the big data, the military threats, the question of whether human rights extend to the outer space, the new threats of nuclear wars in outer space, which is all an issue, and of course climate change. And we are also collecting all the sort of like a documentation, legal documentation, where are the limits of contemporary, sort of, let's say, understanding of human rights and international law.
Thank you very much for your comment. I have a follow-up question on that. In one paper of yours, you argued that people can and should invent new human rights. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I was referring to Claude Lefort, a very interesting late philosopher, French philosopher, whose idea was that human rights are in some way have a certain kind of an emptiness in it, which means that there is a constant discussion going on for, what do they mean? Also, what is the idea of the human? And his idea was also democracy has a kind of a lack and emptiness at its core, that no one can fully, totally occupy the place of power. The place of power is in a way always empty, you only temporarily occupy it. And Claude Lefort's idea was that the human rights are about, kind of a, let's say, expansion, proliferation, rethinking, and that's kind of the idea that I embrace.
I want to agree with the proposition that the human rights canon, the articulation of human rights can't stop. It has to keep developing. As you, Renata, said, the understanding of who is the human changes. And obviously, as that changes, then what is needed to honour us in all our complexity is going to evolve. But so is our lived experience. Before we ever get to deep questions like who is the human, the lived experience is constantly changing. And so it's difficult for the canon of human rights developed in the 50s and 60s to capture the digital revolution. And so that's why the Council of Europe has developed a new convention. So we will always need a new articulation of rights, but this is my key point here. Be incredibly careful. In the first place, the atmosphere is terrible at the moment for human rights. So if you open up the Pandora's box to discuss human rights in an intergovernmental context, there's a real danger you'll go backwards, not forwards. And that is why so many of the systems that we know could be better, we're saying leave them alone, because it's just not the moment to open these things up. Can you imagine if we open up the Refugee Convention for renegotiation today to make it stronger? Well, I think it doesn't take a crystal ball to see what would happen. So that's the first dimension of be careful. The second dimension of be careful, which I believe in no less strongly, is that human rights must evolve from a very wide process of reflection over time. They must have the buy-in of the different societies. How else will we maintain respect for the principle of universality? A quick development of a norm in a particular part of the world that then it is sought to impose elsewhere is not a clever way to proceed, and will ultimately unravel the whole. Will damage the system from within.
Yeah, but Michael, if you look at the last human right, which was adopted in 22, the right to sustainable development, it took 10 years.
Yeah.
It started from civil rights groups, and then it was small countries like Maldives and so on, which asked, the Human Rights Commission at the UN to think about it. They did research, a thorough investigation into it, and then after 10 years it was adopted. So we can say that it is a long process, but nonetheless it was a very important right.
Yeah, but I'm agreeing with you. I'm saying that we could reach the point of adopting a right to development. We could reach the point of the adoption of a right to a safe environment for humans, because the time was taken and the consultation was done, and it was sufficiently wide, broad and inclusive to get a level of acceptance that meant that the right was not then repudiated at birth. So we're in agreement.
Yeah, no, I agree with you also to leave it alone, a lot of the rights which you mentioned. I completely agree with you.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody want to say something about that? Add something, please, madam over there. You're free to say whatever you like.
I just wanted to say that I think that this expression, human rights, is very often manipulated in political narratives, and I think this is what causes this repulse of people towards it. For instance, I'm from Brazil, so there human rights are seen in a negative way because of a narrative built by the far right. They say that human rights are against the victim, that human rights are in favor of the criminals because of the right to a fair trial and the presumption of innocence. But they disregard that the mere fact that they are able to criticize them is because they enjoy a human right, which is freedom of expression. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, unfortunately, we all know that in many regions of the world, people don't enjoy human rights, such as right to life, access to water, access to justice. But I think this is a reason why we have to insist in enforcing human rights and not a reason to jeopardize them.
Thank you very much. Do you want to respond to this?
Just to agree, human rights are instrumentalized all over the place. The term human rights is invoked when it's got either where it's got nothing to do with human rights, or it's being invoked in a deeply mischievous and damaging way. One of the challenges for people like me in recent years has been accepting freedom of expression, even when the expression is corrosive of the things I'm fighting to protect and stand up for. That has been challenging in the context, for example, of the responses to COVID. So I can just agree with you, that's why, by the way, it's a bit of a different topic, but let me throw it in here. We have to put a huge investment in human rights education, again. There's almost no human rights education in our societies anymore. You can get away with saying nonsense about human rights because people don't have the basic knowledge level to challenge you, to say, that's stupid, that's not human rights. Civics, when I was a kid, I don't know, many of you experienced it, civics class in school in my country. That's where you learned about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Basics about human equality, human dignity, mutual respect. Human rights isn't just me, me, me. It's about us. It's about a framework for community. We learned that in school. Kids don't get that in many places today. And without that investment, we allow these people with the crazy remarks to get away with it.
That's an excellent suggestion, but I have a question for you. How do you invest in countries such as Brazil or Turkey, which is also part of Council of Europe? How do you invest in that education about human rights in countries where the governments are against it?
Well, firstly, let's try, okay? Second, let's try where we can do it. I'm not saying, that's not a remark about Turkey or Brazil. I'm just saying, let's try where we can do it. Build up the support base for human rights. In most of the world, nobody's going to object to you putting a bit of human rights in the civics classes in your schools. And by the way, the Global South can teach us how to do human rights education. You mentioned Brazil. Our friend from Brazil will tell you better than I can about the fantastic grassroots efforts to build up awareness of human rights in communities, including in the poorest communities, to enable them to stand up for their rights. We can import a lot of that learning into Europe.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the optimism, definitely. There's a lady back there.
I would also like to support the idea of human rights education done systematically and in all our societies, including in the West and all around the world. They're universal. They are meant to be lifelong, so not only for small kids, but also for their parents and adults, etc. And I'm personally very worried about the dehumanization processes due to the lack of human rights education, because it's so easy to talk about people that are not human beings. It's so easy to treat migrants, illegal or legal, as not real human beings with no real human rights, etc., etc. And I believe those that learn about their rights and especially learn to respect the right of the other, whoever this other is, will more likely have an attitude with an open attitude how to solve problems with this other. So I think I'm a strong believer in human rights education, and also in Turkey 20 years ago you had a very good system of human rights education. I myself did a little project there and elsewhere, but I was very impressed what UNESCO has done in Turkish schools. But this is gone. It's not there. And as you said, we're lacking that in many of our societies now, and I think we should go back to basics, human rights education. By the way, we have a world program since 2005, so it's going to be 20 years next year, but nobody's really paying attention about the world program on human rights education, so back to basics. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Could I add something? Please, there? It's just to complement what was just said. You accused me of optimism. And
that was not an accusation.
It feels like one. It feels like one. Because sometimes when people say that, they mean you're naive. But I'm not. I'm evidence-based. I don't make claims without the evidence. And I just want to say that survey after survey after survey repeatedly demonstrates a huge groundswell of goodness and decency in our societies. This is scientific fact. This isn't speculation. The most recent one was the Open Society Barometer last year, which was carried out right throughout the world, and found that people care about, they care about fair societies. They care about societies where their neighbour is respected. There is decency, and I find this every day in my work, but they need a roadmap. They need a vocabulary to channel that decency. And that's what human rights is all about. So when we promote human rights education, we're simply providing a language to channel an energy that's already there in our societies. By the way, regardless of whether they're repressive societies or repressive regimes or not, that says nothing to the passion of the ordinary people on the street.
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you. I'll be happily naive and will add to human rights and civic education some topics which I just discussed with friends from Israel, Palestine, and South Africa after the first panel, which have to do with anger management, with building hope. Building hope, it's everyday work. It doesn't come, hope doesn't just, fall on us. It is that I'm working on dealing with the past and supporting survivors, but also documenting the resistance to violence. Hope is something to be produced every day. Anger is something to be managed every day. Most of human rights curricula, which I have either practiced or seen, actually do not have anything about emotions. And we are so angry about what's going on that it would be very good to learn something about anger management. It would be also very good to learn something about how to follow news with, daily presentation of atrocities from Gaza, from Ukraine, and remain sane. So how to actually digest that amount of atrocities. So I would say that human rights are a wonderful concept. I fully sign it, and actually it's articulated between the citizens and states. But the part of emotional management, emotional intelligence also, is missing there. So we should find some time and some energy to add something to it, and then to advocate through formal and informal education. In most of countries, formal education will be difficult, but let's not undermine the informal education and what artists and cultural projects can do.
Thank you very much.
May I add something?
Please.
Yes, thank you for these last points, and that's kind of what our initiative of Airspace Tribunals is trying to do, bring art and with visualization to bring it to the general public, how the threat is experienced, also discuss emotional impacts. Anxiety, are conditions which are, everywhere, this anticipating anxiety in regards to potential, let's say, drone attack, and also, surveillance has not been analyzed properly. But I agree with you about anger. However, the problem is that we do live in very complicated time of really parallel realities where anger, plays a very important role in getting acknowledgement. A lot of the fight against facts, against truth, is the search for acknowledgement. I was looking at some research why people are sharing fake news, conspiracy theories in which they don't believe. Not to convince others, but to steer emotions, both emotions of your own group who support you with likes and so on, and anger on the other side. And there is this time now of steering chaos. So we need to be very careful. A lot of, let's say, public discourse and a lot of, let's say, dangerous politicians, they thrive in chaos. And in this chaos also, where the idea is that everyone can find his or her own truth, this highly individualized society, we have a real problem agreeing on certain kind of common principles and, let's say also laws and kind of human rights. So I think we need to understand the psychology of today, which is different than it was a few decades ago.
With deep respect to you, madam, and in no way attempting to contradict you, because I entirely agree with you, I want to talk about 3 necessary emotions for human rights. The first one is anger. We cannot stand up for human rights if we're not angry. We need to be angry. We need to be angry about the hypocrisy. We need to be angry about the double standard. We need to be angry about, you've all mentioned Gaza and you've mentioned Ukraine. I'll mention Sudan. Where's the attention to Sudan? And I could go on, the list goes on. We need to be angry about this. It's anger that changes the world. It's anger that fueled Black Lives Matter, that brought some really serious changes. I could give other examples. We have to channel the anger. We have to manage the anger. But a kind of a righteous anger is essential to change our society. Motion number 1. Motion number 2, empathy. We've got to feel. We have got to feel. We can't just do human rights in theory. Or we can't do it from books and ideas. As crucial to me doing my job, I travel. I cannot do my job if I don't visit the people I'm standing up for or working with. I cannot stand up for Roma, work with Roma, if I don't spend time with Roma in their settlements, in their communities. And not just be angry in there at how we treat them, but also have some sense of a connection in order to then work with them to propel their voice. And then the third bit is hope. I don't know if hope's an emotion, but whatever hope is, I'm very impressed by something Václav Havel said, and I can't quote it exactly, but I'll give you its essence. Havel said, hope isn't something we can choose to have or not have. We have a duty to be hopeful. And I believe that's terribly important. We may be in terrible times, the dystopian world that was painted yesterday, but if we can't see the possibility of the chink of light, if we can't see the possibility of the better future, I don't know, what's the point of getting out of bed in the morning? And now, I won't talk about it because I've gone on too long, never more than 15 minutes, but culture.
It's been 3 minutes. You
is that all? Okay. Yeah, somebody mentioned culture just now, and I was so glad that that came up in the discussion, because engaging all of the social forces to stand up for human rights is essential to their survival and their thriving. And this means, among others, that we have to work much more with cultural practitioners. They're already standing up for human rights, but people like me have to hook up with them and combine our forces. A painter can convey an outrage. Botero, the great Colombian painter who died recently, he painted the horrors in Guantanamo Bay based on those photographs that the soldiers had taken. And I saw his paintings at an exhibition in Rome. I got the atrocities so much more through the genius of Botero than I ever did from seeing these little snapshots online. I can make the same point. Sinead O'Connor, whose first anniversary of her death was just last week. Sinead O'Connor was probably the most powerful human rights champion in my lifetime. She sang. And so we really need to engage. They're already doing the human rights work, but we need to all join up together. That's one world. Sports world is another. A footballer who speaks out or acts out against racism or homophobia or something of that kind is a far more effective messenger than somebody like me ever will be.
Thank you very much for your comments. Before I take the 2 questions, I want to thank our Slovenian friends for making it possible for us to talk about anger. I think this doesn't quite happen quite often, and I really appreciate that. The 2 questions, you and the other lady.
Thank you. It's been really interesting to go from the more theoretical, conceptual now into the practical. And I would like to ask you, because we've heard of practical examples of what can be done, and I would like to also hear from you. Like, if you were asked to do 2 policy recommendations as a philosopher who looks at the past and also a theory, what would you say?
First, I would say that definitely, sort of introduce a kind of a multidisciplinary approach. So I think that understanding today's world, the power of AI, the kind of the emotional side we spoke about, has to go in a way hand in hand with the kind of, let's say, legal, political discussions that we have about, abuses and human rights and so on. So I think that we have kind of forgotten really an interdisciplinary approach. Everyone also in academia is quite enclosed in his or her field. And also we don't collaborate enough with artists. That's one of the things we are trying to do with this project. So our artist, Shona Illingworth, is going to present her work in Slovenia in January to kind of visualize what are the threats coming from above. So I think that, the link with art has been often kind of pushed aside from political debates. And I think art can mobilize people. And also in some way, psychologists, psychoanalysts have been in their own bubble, and I think they need to be brought much more into the discussions, especially what we discussed in a way so far about anger. And also in some way, I think I agree with you with empathy. Identification needs to be in some way kind of strengthened. It happens also with strong journalism. Let's say, just a few weeks ago, I remember for the first time in Haaretz, the English version, they had about 40 images of Gazan victims with their stories. From children to adults, with their personal stories, what they wanted out of their life, what careers as children, they were imagining. Now they're all dead. But for the first time, they had names, and a number of them said, my biggest fear is that I will be just a number. I will be just a number when I die. They were kind of, let's say, living in this anxiety that death is around the corner. This newspaper is very critical of the current regime, but so far they were having only images of their own victims, moving images. You feel really sorry for the young men and women who are dying in a kind of a pointless battle, we can say. Also, for the captured men and women, who are still in Gaza. But for the first time, for the newspaper to show also the story from the other side opens a little bit of an identification.
Thank you very much. We have 2 questions from the third row. First you, madam, and then you.
Hello, Olga Glinska from also representing the European Union. I wanted to bring in a bit of a different perspective, coming back to the discussion between colleagues here. I think a serious issue is that we do not differentiate, in some narratives there is no differentiation between the right to use of force, self-defense, and the human rights and international humanitarian law regimes, which and somehow in the narratives go into a direction whereas some violations of human rights would justify other violations of human rights. And I think it is very important to preserve the integrity of human rights and international humanitarian law, which applies always and without justification for the use of force. But I wanted to move forward to another question, completely separate. How would you navigate the universality of human rights and of the general principles and application in different cultural contexts? So you have mentioned female genital mutilation, which is perhaps not such a controversial example, but I could think of, for example, different perspectives on women's rights in the context of the appearance, the burqa bans, and recently in the Olympic Games, this conversation was brought up again. So exactly, like, we are not uniform, of course, we have not a uniform culture, so how to navigate the universality of human rights with the different cultural contexts. Thank you.
You expressed the question I intended to ask in a better manner, so thank you for that.
You're going to be better, or she's going to be better? That was ambiguous.
She's better.
Okay, I'd like to jump in if you don't mind.
Yeah.
First, I want to correct something. I said Guantanamo Bay, and I just realized I meant Abu Ghraib. So just for the record, I was referring to Abu Ghraib in Afghanistan, not Guantanamo Bay, even though it's all...
You could have too.
Well, anyway, I'm corrected now. Look, this business of regionalism and universal human rights is not new. It's been going the rounds forever. It was a huge debate 25 years ago, and now it's recurring again. But we need to bring the learning that we acquired back 20 years ago into the debate today. We learned a lot about how to manage this issue. First thing we learned to recognize is to call out fake cultural claims. Very often we have found politicians or influential elite people saying it's against our culture to do A, B, C, D, E, and F. When the anthropologists get to dig into that claim, it's perceived to be nonsense. So the homosexuality, for example, the one you didn't mention, though you could have easily. The prohibition on homosexual acts in many countries was brought with the British colonial powers. It was never there beforehand. And we don't have time to go into more detail on that, but it's an example. The second thing is we make cultural claims. This doesn't belong in our region. This is not for us. But hey, we don't ask the people impacted. Who asks the women? So when the Taliban make these preposterous claims about, in fact, preposterous treatment of women and girls, every impression I get from my context, from my engagements, is that if you gave women and girls the chance to have their opinion on this, these restraints will be gone tomorrow. The third is there's no such thing as cultural homogeneity. Again, these arguments about this is not right for my region, this doesn't belong in my region, they derive from a model of my region as a homogeneous, globally the same thing. But we all know, look at our own diversities. Look at the extent in this room to which there must be an astonishing range of self-identities, self-expressions, self-understandings of who I am, what my role is, what our society is. I don't know how many people are here, you're going to get the same number of different answers. It's no different in these parts of the world where people are invoking regional difference to keep the human rights from coming in. Last thing I'll say, because I could go on forever on this topic, is that I typically find in a region where people are saying this is not appropriate for my region, local civil society is rarely in agreement with those elite voices. And that has to tell me something about the spectacles with which I should look at such claims.
I will just add something in regard to the first part of your question. You are very much, I'm very much in agreement with you. One of the biggest problems for international law, and especially international humanitarian law, has been happening after September 11 with the idea of preventive war and preemptive strikes. And, you know, a number of countries have sort of embraced this idea that you kill before someone becomes an actual threat. So we don't anymore respect the idea that there should be an immediate threat, a clear threat, that there should be a proportionate response, but basically you go to another country and you decide that someone is a potential threat. I remember how Pompeo, when America decided to kill Soleimani, was saying, sort of it's not clear what we will do, but he is dangerous. There is he will attack, that he will kind of mastermind attack, but we don't know when. And so you don't know what kind of threat, but you feel that you have the power that you can intervene. And that's a huge, I think, violation of all the international law in regard to armed conflict and humanitarian law too.
Thank you very much. We can take your question.
Thank you very much for giving me the word. My name is Jana Botikova. I'm one of the Young Bled Strategic Forum participants. And this morning I attended a panel, and let me read the name because I did not learn it by heart, but the name was Private Contributions to Cyber Operations and International Law Perspective. And the panelists, they touched not only the cyberspace, the private actors in them, but also the human rights. And I'm going towards my question because during the panel they stressed especially the lack of holistic understanding among our states when it comes to cyberspace, when it comes to human rights, the, let's say, online human rights. So my question is, what can be done to reach this consensus or this holistic understanding and better enforcement, better implementation of human rights also in the online space? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question, and thanks. I'm really thankful that somebody from Young BSF asked the question. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, yes, as part of our civil rights project, we are looking at this issue, So our idea is to actually, start thinking about, positive and negative rights in regards to what you said, the new technologies, what might be sort of like the powers of the states in regard to the satellites, to the collection of data, what might be sort of also provisions, especially since, for example, if you send a satellite to the outer space, it is the country where the company is registered that is responsible for that satellite, not where the satellite is going to be placed. And so we think if the human rights idea is more present in thinking about, those kind of a new, especially surveillance type of machineries, the states would have the responsibility to kind of bring this discussion of human rights already when they are giving the license to the companies. Then we have a problem of sort of public-private. A lot of the states are using private companies, and private companies are also in some way, we can say, now really proliferating at the outer space. We have so much mess up there, so much the debris related to it. Who is responsible for that? So that there we think there has to be also kind of this kind of a negative element, the idea of the responsibility, who will be in a way responsible. So stricter responsibility, stricter question of liability, and introduction of human rights issues also sort of, let's say, beyond the Earth, because outer space, for example, is very much part of the Earth. It's not a kind of a separate territory, which is why some theorists are speaking about kind of a, let's say, a new, broader definition of how far human rights really expand, and they do not let's say, limit themselves in just the airspace, but go in a way beyond.
Where the humans are, maybe we can talk about the rights as well. So that's a very interesting and important observation. Mr. Flarty, please.
First, a few quick observations to Renata's comments just now. It's a little bit removed from your question, but I'll come back to that in a second. It's just there's really important discussions to be had now about the next generation of human rights. I spoke about how rights emerge and grow, and I didn't speak to this point, which is some of the increasingly unsustainable models we currently have. So right now, human rights is essentially a contract between the state and the human being, but in a context where the state is not the primary driver of the wrong or the harm, or it's some other state. And we may need some new model of this basic contract as we move into the future. The second dimension of moving into the future is literally protecting the future. And so there's necessarily a new debate about the human rights of future generations and how we protect those. Not in the future, but now. And some countries, including I think yours, because I know you're from the Czech Republic, I think your country appointed an ombudsman for the future, an ombudsperson for the future. And these kind of ideas are taking traction. And then the third dimension, I'll mention it and move on, is what is the human? Where in the context of AI-supported life does human life begin and end? I'm going to leave the answer to that to Renata, not me, but it is one that needs to be addressed. Now, on the business of building up awareness, let me drill it down and come back specifically to AI, because if I give you an abstract over all the place question, I'll say nothing. But we learned a lot in the whole exercise of trying to regulate AI. First thing we learned was that there's a skewed understanding of human rights in industry, in the tech sector. It's not that they're bad people trying to do bad stuff, but they get certain human rights elements and not others. At least that was maybe the case 3 or 4 years ago. They got privacy. Everybody understood privacy as an issue. Non-discrimination, huge confusion. And then less and less understanding as you go across the line of issues. And so the tech companies need to invest far more in building the human rights literacy of their own people. Not necessarily the engineer, but the policy person in there. And we still have a way to go in at least some parts of that industry. And then the second part was in oversight of AI, the extent of human rights investment was undervalued, and I would argue still is undervalued. So everybody gets privacy, so the data protection regulators have been given a big role in AI oversight. But human rights is more than data protection. It's all those things I mentioned earlier, access to social welfare, all the other manner of issues. But we still have a long way to go on that. So I don't want to give a boring old answer, but it really does come back to investing in awareness raising and education, but not just for the state, but also for the private sector.
We started talking about the future of human rights, which I find really interesting, and that we're approaching the end. We still have, really? 9 minutes until the end. That's why I'm not going to do a poll. I don't want to annoy you, but I just want to give you the chance to, if you personally had the chance to suggest a new human right, what would you suggest? You can just shout in. You're invited by all these chic guys, and you're allowed to add something to some charter.
The right to truth.
Well played, yes. What else? Yeah, do you want to elaborate on that? You can say no.
Yeah, I would think that truth is under attack, right? The facts are under attack. So the right to be informed and undisputed fact as the basis for conversation. Not truth in the sense of truth after conflict and justice after conflict, but really it's important for humanity to agree on facts and find a dialogue around these facts. And it seems so obvious, but I think it's actually in danger.
That's a good point, but is this information today a violation of human rights, or should we add a new human right to our charters to call it that? What do you think?
You raise such an immensely complex issue, because we can all agree that we want truth, but then legislating, regulating for truth is a minefield, because we also respect freedom of expression. So we have to allow a certain space for people to say stuff that we don't like, that we disagree with. We also have to accept that it's not that there are different truths, but we can all argue about the truth. And it's only through the argument that we'll actually discern what the truth is. And that requires us to have a certain space in which to have different expressions. We've had a really difficult issue in human rights with regard to so-called memory laws. These are laws which you find typically, not typically, but commonly in Europe, Germany, for example, where you're not allowed to say certain things about the past. And they raise complex issues. When is a memory law a violation of, let's say, academic free speech, or when is it a legitimate management of our society today? So I'm not coming down one way or the other with you. I'm just saying that regulating for a right to truth that respects other rights would be a tricky and difficult act. Although we do have a right to truth in some elements. There are certain extreme forms of hate-filled lie which are already criminalized, and we need to enforce those laws. And so there is a space. But we have to keep a close watch on it, that it doesn't expand too rapidly and too widely.
I'm going to, please.
Just say, so my last book was called A Passion for Ignorance, Why People Choose Not to Know and Why. What people choose not to know and why. And actually, a lot of people, for personal or, other reasons, don't want truth. And there are a lot of energies also by states or, also companies to keep people in blindness. So I would say, yes, the desire to have a kind of an agreement about facts and truth at some point, because, truth is often very individual. What is truthful for someone might not be truthful for someone else. So we can say that to a point, I would say I agree with you, but it's something that will be in today's time almost like impossible. Mm-hmm. And because there is less and less desire for truth and more power actually to obfuscate it, in particular from, let's say, very high up politicians. Mm-hmm. If you look at the top authoritarians today, they thrive in lies, and actually they encourage lies. And, of course, they don't want people to agree on truth, because when you have people in doubt, then you can really, guide them the way you want.
We don't need a human right to truth per se, or indeed a human right against lies per se, in order to invest massively in tackling disinformation. And we're not doing that enough. We're treating disinformation as a minor problem still, despite the fact that it's so corrosive and it's so badly influencing our society. And Lord knows we've seen the evidence enough now for this. And so our states, our governments, every social force has to invest in pushing back against lie, pushing back against disinformation, presenting the alternative story. And that's everything from building up media literacy for kids to investing in detecting and pushing back against the lie at the level of the state.
But also to kind of break up the monopolies of the big companies, and also, in America, to change the laws which are allowing them to have all the freedom, no responsibility for the content that they are, sharing.
Thank you very much. Please.
Just to make it a bit more precise than right to truth, I guess what is behind is right to acknowledgement of facts, especially regarding violations of international humanitarian law, which are disputed en masse by leaders of the countries, post-Yugoslav countries. Yeah. Even the facts which have been proven beyond reasonable doubt in the court of law. And there is hardly any reaction to that. And this is very problematic for survivors and for families of victims, wherever. And what is very difficult for someone living in Gaza is, to feel that there is no acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is very much a matter of heart. So let's contemplate, maybe it's not just about new right, maybe it's about consultations in which we would look together from different perspectives what to do actually about this lack of acknowledgement. What would be the mechanisms, how to act? Because people really feel my suffering, I am not acknowledged. My dignity is not respected. And it's a problem en masse. Mm-hmm.
I went in the morning to the discussion with Albi Sachs, and he was speaking exactly about that there is a difference between knowledge and acknowledgement. And when he was fighting for Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, that was his point, to actually acknowledge different type of pains, but also to come forward with truth, to admit, the atrocities that people have been committing.
Please.
I also value the emphasis on acknowledgement. It's part of the motivation I have to travel and be with rights holders as much as possible. They tell me repeatedly that just being with them is already empowering, that somebody made the effort to make the journey and come and sit and listen. I can't fix stuff. My toolbox is what it is, but just what we call accompaniment is already empowering, and I believe that for very many years. But your talk about Albie Sachs and the South African experience opens up this huge issue then of dealing with our past and healing our past through acknowledgement, through truth-telling. We're talking an awful lot at the moment about criminal justice for Ukraine, quite correctly, but we need more than that. We need a much broader social engagement with looking at what is happening, what will happen, what will have happened, with a view towards acknowledgement of the pain wherever it's to be found, which is essential to the healing. We won't have safe future communities if we don't fix these issues now and for the past.
Thank you very much. We only have 3 minutes, and I'm going to give the chance to make the closing statement to a member of the audience in a minute. But before that, I have one other favor to ask you. What would you recommend to one another if you have the chance? What would you recommend to each other to make the world, the state of human rights, a better place? Ladies first, Ms. Salecl, what do you think that the international, supranational organizations and actors such as Mr. Flaherty should do differently for the promotion of human rights? Where do you see a room for improvement?
I don't know enough of what you have as a plan for your 5 years, so I would just encourage you to keep the fight that you are proposing, and I felt that you are honestly really fighting for the kind of expansion of the understanding of human rights worldwide. So I hope that we meet again in maybe a year, and then I will see what you can do better, because you just took this job. I don't know if you did already some mistakes.
Give him some time. Thank you very much. Mr. Flaherty, what would you recommend somebody from the academia?
Well, first, Renata, thank you very much. As some people will know, I've also straddled the academia and the practice world. So I'm speaking a little bit about my world when I talk about academia. But I would really hope you'll continue to do what you're doing right now, promoting a multidisciplinary approach to human rights, but on the basis of a belief in human rights. And you do that, and we need far more of that. We must call out freedom to say what they want. We can't stop them saying it. But we really have to challenge this lazy, elite discussion in academia about have human rights past their utility? Can we now move on to another way of organizing the world? Wake up. Who are you people? You never knew a day of deprivation in your life, and you sit in your cozy chair making these opening up these very dangerous discussions and reflections. So let them have the discussions and reflections, but at a minimum, let's push back and counter every one of their arguments. So that is what I would encourage Renata to keep doing.
Thank you very much. Who wants to end the session? 30 seconds, just a comment, please.
If friends, colleagues allow me, I just want to use this opportunity to thank both Renata and also commend her excellent work on, especially on the idea of knowledge and the book on the passion for ignorance, because in the knowing what is true or not true is so important, especially in the context of human rights, and also to thank Mr. Flaherty for his contribution, especially, and congratulate him for becoming the new commissioner, so to have a wider coverage, and I guess now you will have actually more serious issues, because you'll be also covering the countries like Turkey, Ukraine, Russia, and so on. So I want to encourage you also to continue with this effort, which I know is not easy. It becomes more difficult as you go. But I also am happy to have heard all the different comments on the different subject areas. And I think we all agree that it's a subject that everybody is very passionate about. So it's good to know that everybody is passionate about human rights, and that also we agreed on universality, that it's something that doesn't depend on where it happens, how it happens, but that there is a lot of work to be done in looking for the best way, how do we enforce, how do we put it into practice, and the best way to find the way to ascertain what is going on, where we can implement it, and so on. So thanks to both the speakers and also to you, of course, for
that was a great
this.
closing statement. You didn't leave anything else to say to me. Thank you very much to the members of the audience and for being here, for your time. Thank you very much, and have a nice last 2 hours. Thank you very much.